Hi everyone, thanks for joining this webinar with iTech. My name is Warren. I'll be hosting this webinar today with Charlie. Thanks first of all, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you spending the time with us today. If there's a lot to cover in this session, and I think hopefully that we may answer a lot and give some insightful information around what Zero Trust is, and also. We'll also provide some further information at the end of the webinar to hopefully help you out in other ways. So going on from that, really, this webinar, Zero Trust, with the proliferation of remote working and the need to stay productive, I think it's top of mind really that for a lot of organizations this has forced a new way of working, and that has introduced other factors for security, and a key part of that is what we're going to talk about, which is Zero Trust. And Zero Trust really is a new model for securing and providing that productivity that modern businesses need. So on that, I'm gonna hand over to my colleague Charlie, who's our lead cloud consultant, and we'll go from there.
Hi all, I'm Charlie Goff. So as Warren's nicely introduced me, so yeah, let's get started on today's webinar around Zero Trust. So the first point is why Zero Trust. So we take it back a little bit, beginning of time, or beginning of computers and networks and everything was very much in a traditional corporate boundary. So your whole network would be in a secure boundary protected by your firewall, and it came in, basically you control what came in and out. Obviously internet's started, we've got more services available, we've got no longer just our users, as employees, we've got partners, clients, contractors all coming into our environment, then they're using their own personal devices, accessing files and other environments, other services all in the cloud. So suddenly this traditional model of everything being locked completely in this single boundary disappears, and we end up into really a big mesh of different services connecting in. So from that point, really, the security model we've known has had to change.
So the question is, I guess, Charlie, it's, why Zero Trust? Like, you've mentioned there's, the threat, attack vector has kind of changed a little bit and a lot. Data breaches, ransomware has become the most common reason for security issues, and we know that it's not just the big enterprises that get hit by that; it's also the small companies. But by using these modern authentication mechanisms, there are ways that we'll talk about today that are actually very cost effective and easy to implement, but will actually give you the same sort of features that an enterprise would have.
So yeah, exactly. It's around the data breaches. So obviously with the wider attack vector, that's made us change the way we think about things and how we protect that data. So from kind of a Zero Trust perspective, we moved to our Zero Trust principles. So from a principle perspective, Zero Trust changes the old assumptions of effectively trusting your employees, trusting your privileged users, and effectively that you would know when you're breached. And so we've had to change these assumptions and think along the lines of these new principles. So from that, we've got 3 new principles: verify explicitly, use least privileged access, and assume breach. So verify explicitly, just a quick overview, is authenticate and authorize based on different data points. So no longer is your username and password enough. Actually, you want to know user identity, you want to know the location, the device health, the service or workload, the data classifications, and whether there's been any anomalies from this. And that's quite critical, really, to understand whether an account's been breached or not, or whether there's an issue with a user's username and password, or their password is available elsewhere. Then we look at kind of the least privilege approach. So quite often, we'll go into a little bit more detail further down the line, but quite often the view's always been, well, if it doesn't work, let's give somebody elevated rights to make it work. Well, those rights potentially stick around and they stay sticky. So suddenly Joe Bloggs, who needs to access a finance file, one file within the finance sector, knows that one file and has access to the finance folder. Well, they don't need access to the rest of the finance folder. So, but that permission then stayed. So least privilege is not just about your administration, it's about administration accounts. It's about your user levels and understanding how you really protect yourself and ensure that you just have just-in-time access or just enough access to be able to do your staff to be able to do the job, and also how they request that access. Assumed breaches are very much a different way of thinking. So often from an IT standpoint, IT professionals used to hate to think that their network had been breached. They'd had an attack of some sort. Well, the assumed breach side of things looks at how you think about a breach and how you think about putting in new solutions. So ensuring that actually, if you've got a cloud application, how you get from A to B and how you stop that movement and how you develop your new solutions. So being more aware around your network user and devices and how that's segmented. And again, it comes back to verifying all sessions are encrypted. Using the key one here is really using analytics and to get visibility and drive that threat detection and improve your defenses. So you start limiting those available attack vectors. So the next key bit is around how and where zero trust is applied. So with zero trust, it's applied throughout the digital estate. So it's no longer we're not going to just tackle one element. We've got to tackle potentially all 6 elements to actually make zero trust work. So very, very quickly, obviously identities are no longer just a person. They can represent a service or an IoT device. And that's when an basically then devices it's no longer your corporate device. That could be a personal iPhone, Android phone. It could be a personal laptop. It could be a partner device, and also kind of your on-premise and cloud hosted servers as well. Then applications. So obviously applications are the piece that integrates and interfaces with our data and how defines how our data is consumed. So we've still got, however we look at it, most companies still have legacy applications, some have SaaS applications, and actually the way that we work as organizations now and individuals dictate how our organizations work, because people want to use applications they're familiar with. And this is where kind of something that's grown fairly recently in the last kind of 3-4 years really is shadow IT, where if you've got a credit card, you can go and buy a cloud service, and that could be one of your employees or a member of staff, and that wouldn't be known to the business. So data could be moving on to data. You could have data then stored up in various clouds all over the place. And again, you don't know where that data is being accessed. You don't know what necessarily that data is being classified or labeled as, if it's being classified or labeled at all. And obviously under GDPR, that presents certain risks. And again, infrastructure is no longer on-premise. It's on-premise servers, it's data centers, it's public cloud services as well. We'll go through that in more detail. And network. So we've always looked at protecting the network with firewalls, switching and segmenting, but this is more around, you can't necessarily segment a connection to a cloud service that's publicly available on the internet. So it's how you monitor that and provide protection for your employees and your businesses. So with all of those 6 foundational elements, they're all a source of signal and allows you to then build the control plane for the enforcement and enables you to defend. So we move on to kind of like a high level architecture approach that Microsoft provide us. And with that approach, what we start to look at is kind of, this goes into a little bit more depth around obviously the identities, devices, data apps, infrastructure and network. And I quite like to use an analogy around this. So if you think of it as an airport, so when you go to the airport, not that many of us have been going in recent years or recent times in the last year because of the current pandemic, but you go to the airport, you have your boarding card and your passport, you have your bag, whether that's hand luggage or a suitcase to put into the hold. Those are your two, that's your passport and your boarding card is your identity. Your suitcase, hand luggage is your device. So the first point you get to is the security, and the security policy enforcement is your departure security check. So first point you get to when you get to an airport is you have to go through security to get into departures. So without the appropriate multi-factor of passport and boarding pass, or identity and boarding pass effectively, so multi-factor there, you're not going to get through. And also there's an element of risk as well that takes into account with that. So there's analytics that are provided to do that. And the same goes with devices. Now, you take your suitcase goes through security. If you've got a liquid in there, suddenly that's going to be rejected out and you're going to have to remediate that piece. It's exactly the same with your devices. So from a device perspective, you've got to make sure your devices are compliant and healthy. So feeding those two elements in, if they pass the security check, then you get into the departure lounge. Now, the departure lounge side of things is where, if you say take apps as an example, that's your shops, your duty-free shops. Now, not everyone has access to the shops in some way. However, and the same could be said with data and infrastructure, actually, it follows the same method. However, if I'm flying locally, if I'm flying from Bristol to Edinburgh as an example, well, I don't qualify for duty free, but to be able to buy something, I need to show my boarding pass. So I know whether it's VAT free. So you kind of get the picture of where the analogy comes from Zero Trust. And again, right across the layer is that visibility and analytics and monitoring of the whole piece, because as soon as you go through that first security checkpoint, that's not the last security checkpoint that you have to go through. You've got the security checkpoint at the gate where you board the plane, and also once you arrive at your destination as well. So we're going to break down into the various elements that we touched on around identities, devices, apps, data, infrastructure and network. So the first one we're going to touch on is identity. So the real objective around Zero Trust is with identities is basically identities no longer represent a person. They represent a person, a service, an IoT device. Now that person may be an employee, that person may be a contractor, a partner, a client. There's a raft of use for that identity piece. And effectively with that, you need to have a strong identity, because that is a critical element of Zero Trust, strong authentication. Now, obviously from a authentication, if a good example of that is online banking. So previously, I think I'm just trying to go back how many years now, but several years ago, you used to have an ID number and a PIN code that you go in and you could sign into your bank with most banks. Now, you've got to have, say, either an app on your phone, your ID, your app on your phone, and usually a PIN code as well. So you're starting to talk about multi-factor, and we're doing this in everyday life. And then once you're actually in that environment, to go and set up a new pay or make a payment, you've got to verify again to make sure that you have the privilege to be able to do that and you are still who you say you are. So breaking that down into kind of the four key areas, so and moving more into kind of what the identity element is the first piece is around single sign-on. So from a single sign-on perspective, we all know that we have a large amount of applications across our estates and our organizations. So one of the key benefits of single sign-on is it reduces some of the risks, because if we have a password for each of those applications, suddenly actually, and if you think about it from a personal perspective, and I know I'm guilty as most people here, but from a personal perspective, you have pretty much the same password for various things in your personal life. So your Amazon account, your eBay account, your PayPal account, all will be very, very similar passwords, because it's human nature, because there's no option of that single sign-on. So your employees are going to be doing that. Your staff, your employees, your contractors, anybody working within your organizations will be doing very similar within your business around that. Then it's kind of the productivity benefits around single sign-on. So again, having all your apps in that one-stop shop for company applications, so that from a user perspective, you click on an app and it logs you in. It gets you to where you need to be without having to re-enter your password. Now, that kind of then links on to the next stage around verification of identities. So this talks very much around, and we've already touched on multi-factor authentication, MFA, quite a bit. So this is your identity is your front door, and if you don't protect your front door, somebody's going to get into your hallway, etc. And that approach. And with that in mind, MFA, just by implementing MFA to your users or to your organization, it can help prevent over 99.9% of attacks on your identities. So that's things like your phishing attacks, any kind of attack trying to gain access to your environment just by entering MFA. Then you've got passwordless. So recommendations now from a Microsoft standpoint is to never expire a password within the cloud environment and actually move to more of a passwordless piece. And what passwordless means is signing in via your mobile phone. So through the Microsoft Authenticator app. And we're going to go, as we go through these slides, we're going to go in more detail and explain it in a little bit more detail near the end. Then you've got the risk assessment. So from the risk assessment side of things, controlling access and using policies to risk assess how people are accessing your environment. So this is what Microsoft call conditional access. So that bubble that we talked about a minute ago, the security policy enforcement, that was our departure security. This is where the conditional access comes in. So this looks at multiple factors, contextual factors, so your location, date. It's very data-driven approach to looking at whether the account's breached or whether you're logging in suddenly from Mumbai or somewhere else in a short period of time. It looks at that data and it helps define whether actually to allow, deny, or even control your access by adding additional challenges. So like MFA, like in terms of use, or even restricting that access in that session down. Then finally is we touch on least privilege again. So one stat I heard recently was on average, it takes around an average of 74 days to find or contain a malicious actor within an environment, and 80% of those breaches usually involve your privileged credentials. Now, obviously, that's very much tackling your administrators, the people owning those higher privileged accounts within your IT teams, but it's not just that level of privilege. It could be your financial data, it could be your HR data that is actually owned by the business. Now, what we need to start thinking about from this is a user needs what they need to be able to do their job. Now, that might not be the entire share of the finance directory or the HR directory. They might just need one aspect of that, but how do you control that one aspect? And it comes down to obviously the business owner of the data or the application giving that approval, because the IT team doesn't necessarily know whether that person requires that level of access. And so it's about evaluating and monitoring these permissions throughout that life cycle of the user, and ensuring that they have it when they need it, but they don't have it necessarily all the time, and ensuring that actually when they no longer need that or they leave, we remove those rights and their account is no longer available and is disabled. So really good practice around account management and that end-to-end life cycle of an input of a user, whether that's an employee partner or such. So we move kind of onto devices now, and from a device perspective, as we already said, we only want to allow compliant and trusted apps and devices to access our data. So we don't, and this is where the suitcase comes into it. If you think about the suitcase going through security, being scanned, we don't want a suitcase, or from an organization perspective, you don't want a suitcase with a bomb in it to go through. And this is kind of where we've got to think of around that whole approach of how we ensure our workloads are compliant and we monitor that. And that becomes more difficult when you've got more personal devices, partner managed devices coming into the mix. So from a device perspective, we are very much talking about visibility of health and compliance. So there's two trains of thoughts here, because obviously not all devices are going to be owned by your organization. Some will be owned by your users, some will be owned by third parties and partners. So how can you make sure that they're enforced consistently and reliably? And how can you make sure that actually that device hasn't been compromised without enrolling it into your environment? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. So with conditional access and with kind of some of the tool sets from Microsoft, we can check that device health to a point. If it's enrolled, we can check that device is compliant. We can check whether the antivirus is up to date, whether it's patched fully, whether it's got any threats on there at all. And we can use the conditional access process again to block any of those until they're remediated. Now, the BYOD side of things is a little bit more complex. Now, in theory, from BYOD perspective, you don't want those users bringing that data onto their local PC. So what you can do is you can restrict the sessions. So allowing that user only to work within a browser as an example, so they can't download a local copy. Or mobile devices, rather than having them enrolled into your corporate environment, you can give them an application that is wrapped, that is secure and protects your company data, so that data can actually be pulled out or copied out in any way. So therefore it's protecting that data. Now, and then suddenly if that device is lost, rather than wiping the whole, or the person leaves even the organization, rather than wiping the whole device and their personal mobile device being under the control of the organization, you can just wrap that individual application. You can just wipe that one element of it. So suddenly you know that your company data is secured. That kind of then leads us on to the application estate. So when we talk about applications, the main purpose of an application is it's the interface of our data. It interfaces with our data and tells us, so our email system, whether that's Exchange Online or on-premise or another cloud email system, we use Outlook or a web browser, but we're using an application to consume that data. So we want to make sure, and same with files. whether that's SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, etc. We want to make sure that we can grant the appropriate access for every app based on the user and the device and where they're connecting from. So with the application side of things, the first thing is we need to know what is being used within our environments. So visibility, we talk a lot about visibility and control. So we can only, as organizations, we can only control what we know about. We don't know, if we don't have any visibility of our application estate, we don't know what Joe Bloggs over in legal is using this cloud-based application to store critical legal files. We won't know that. And so we need to start discovering this. This is this shadow IT piece that we touched on a minute ago. We need to start discovering where that data is being stored, what applications are being used to store that data. And this allows us to then do a couple of things around it. So it allows us to assess the risk. It allows us to assess whether it's actually, there's a justifiable need. And from there, we can look to either block the access or allow access, or even more importantly, apply a policy. And finally, kind of, if there is an approved application which does the same job, so a great example of this, we can guide those users to use that application. So a good example of this is Dropbox. A lot of organizations have Dropbox. Now, organizations I've worked in the past have had Dropbox being used by their employees, however, with their corporate email accounts. And they've had, from a IT point of view, we've had emails, letters come through from Dropbox saying, well, we know that this number of employees are using Dropbox, and you now need to start paying for a Dropbox service because they've done it on the free plan. So with Dropbox, obviously the example from Microsoft's standpoint would be OneDrive for Business and using OneDrive. So trying to transition those users from Dropbox to OneDrive is a lot easier. Now, there might be a business reason why they need to use that. They might be using it to work with partners, but it's about us understanding and having that visibility to be able to make that informed decision based on the data. Then once we've got that information, we can start looking at kind of adaptive controls. So this is where we talked about a minute ago regarding, we briefly touched on it around session monitoring and managing unmanaged devices with trusted users. So this is ensuring that authorized users can gain access to corporate resources on devices, whether they're managed or unmanaged, but how we then control those sessions. So these are things like limiting access to read-only or blocking download, or even applying additional protections to documents which are downloaded, so that if I send a document out, I know that that document's not going to be used elsewhere. And a great example of this is a non-profit I worked with in the past had a document which went to a volunteer community, and within there, that then got sent on to a national newspaper, which suddenly got leaked out into the national newspapers. And obviously that wasn't necessarily a financial impact, but it was a reputational impact, which is more important from a non-profit side of things. And now we start talking about how we need to make sure we're protecting the data anywhere it may exist. So this is where kind of the GDPR piece comes in, protecting our personal identifiable information of our employees, our partners, our clients, anybody involved in our organization. So looking at how we can classify, label and protect files based on that sensitivity, and ensuring that we bring people to the data rather than that data leaving our organization. Apologies. And then finally, it's about understanding that we are going to be using different cloud applications, and we are going to be using not just one cloud environment. So how we can protect that data and detect unusual behavior across multiple cloud apps and identify whether ransomware or compromised users or rogue applications, and then start to try and remediate and limit that risk to your organization. I'm now going to pass you over to Warren, who's going to move on to the next three.
Thanks, Charlie. So when it comes to infrastructure, this represents, whether it's on premise or in the cloud, it represents a critical threat vector. We have many clients that operate in a on-prem and a hybrid and a full public cloud deployment. So the deployment of infrastructure services is absolutely critical to businesses to adopt into their zero trust strategy. So with that, some of the common recommendations we have. Next slide there, Charlie, please. So first of all, micro-segmentation is a very popular way of isolating services. So whether that's on premise, it could be network segregation, but also going a step further where software-defined networking can support the ability to dynamically stop traffic between networks based on user identity rather than just network access. The ability to making sure that you regularly patch and look for vulnerabilities in your software stack as well. Absolutely critical to understand quickly if you have any potential vulnerabilities that could form a potential security risk. Celerigate being one of them, but also many others. And also being able to react to them quickly, and a key part to that really is real-time threat monitoring and detection. It's absolutely critical to being able to get insight into where vulnerabilities exist and to be able to mitigate them quickly. And all of this really, it does sound like quite a huge task, and it may seem quite daunting, but actually with a lot of these principles that we're talking about, a lot of them are actually built into the platforms, the cloud platforms, and instilled into a lot of new technologies. And really the main takeaway for that is that they're there to enable productivity and efficiency. These platforms will help your business grow, be more productive, allow your users to communicate and collaborate easier, but also implement those kind of security guardrails in the background. Next slide, please, Charlie. When it comes to the network, really, it kind of a similar, I guess, approach to infrastructure. Again, it is about kind of putting those guardrails in place to make sure that your infrastructure services, your data is secured in the right way. And with that, common approaches include, again, next slide, please, Charlie. Micro-segmentation. Typically, a lot of networks allow what's called east-west traversal. So you have data coming into your data center or your network environment from the internet or a PWAN, and then when it gets into the network, effectively, some traditional solutions might allow you to go across that estate very quickly, and there are kind of malware attacks that are quite widely publicized, like NotPetya, for example, being a popular one from 2017, that can quickly get through the network and then start to encrypt services, encrypt data, and actually make everything within that network unusable very quickly. So by stopping that east-west traversal, it actually locks down everything within the infrastructure, so it's contained and it's not allowed to get out into the core network. On top of that, again, that real-time threat protection, understanding what's going in and out of the network is absolutely critical, and that comes back to real-time telemetry from signal endpoints, and that's what Charlie talked about earlier. It's everything from the network devices, the operating systems, the users, and other signal sources such as the cloud services. And then another key fundamental principle really for me and for many others is the encryption piece, and that's really what's allowed the public cloud to become a fundamental strategy for many organizations. And it really data encryption, whether it in transit, so over the network, or at rest where it's encrypted data, absolutely core fundamental principle to support both on-premise data storage, but also communications between your company and other companies. It protects everything that is being consumed within your business. And with that encryption piece, really, that's really kind of been a fundamental building block for public cloud services, which are now secured to such an extent that it is perfectly safe to store data in the public cloud, as long as you're following those best practice approaches. There are even ways to keep the keys, so where you create certificates and keys and public and private keys. You can create the keys and own them yourself and keep them outside the public cloud platform, but the data remains in there, safe and secure. And that's kind of worked in complementary with the real-time threat protection, so and also the auditing piece as well. So, and going on from that, one of the things I really like is the real-time analytics and profiling in Cloud App Security, which is a Microsoft product. Effectively, you can pick up real-time telemetry from every part of your organization, and there are many signal endpoints that you can integrate to this. A good example for me is you can link this to your perimeter firewalls if you're running on premise, and it will pick up all of the analytics, all of the logs from your device, and analyze that activity, and then actually give you insight into your platform. You can then see who inside your organization is using things like Dropbox, like Charlie mentioned earlier. You could then look at what applications are being accessed and actually look into, is the profile of that application safe? Are there vulnerabilities with it? Are there known issues with the way that it works? And that becomes a risk profile that actually becomes visible to the business. And then on top of that, once you get that overall profile, you can build it in with additional signal endpoints. So, like again, Charlie's example earlier, whereby we had Dropbox, you could add Dropbox in as a signal endpoint and actually pick up what kind of data is being stored in the cloud. So again, it allows you to instill governance, find out what's being consumed. If it is a thing that is needed, should it be stopped? Are there other ways that users should be using those services? So it's a real fundamental, for me, it's a real eye-opener and a real way of showing that those enterprise type capabilities that would have 10 years ago been very, very time consuming and costly to deliver are available now, and they're actually able to deliver very quickly real-time insights into product and user activity and data usage. So leading on to data, 88% of organizations no longer have confidence to detect and prevent loss of sensitive data. Apparently, that's a fact that we picked up, and I think a lot of that is true, because I think without that cloud platform to support that sort of deeper insight, it becomes very difficult to meet things like next slide, actually, Charlie, please. Talk about e-discovery. So e-discovery, typically on premise, it's very difficult to achieve. It's possible, but in terms of storage and everything else that goes with it, and the configuration setup can be very time consuming. Whereas by enabling that cloud piece, a good example is Office 365. So we talk about enabling e-discovery. You can get really deep insights into what data is being sent outside your organization. Is it being secured? Is it sensitive information? Should it even be sent outside your organization? And again, introduce other complementary technologies such as data encryption or sensitivity tagging. So, for example, you could have confidential information being sent by the senior management team that's only sent to senior management team members or selected people outside your organization. And if it is sent outside your organization, you can then set encryption policies to automatically encrypt and delete that information on other devices. So it's incredibly powerful. And another good example with regards to that visibility of sensitive data, with regards to Exchange Online is a very popular mechanism for email communications, both inside and outside organizations. But being able to get deep visibility into how are people using those services. And a good example, one of our clients was predominantly on-prem, and they moved to Exchange Online. And with that move became a much deeper insight into how people were using their data and communicating with each other. And it turns out that they were sending over 2 million emails a month, of which 70% of that email traffic was being generated by a mobile device. So again, they were really shocked because they thought that the most of that communication would all be via laptop. But again, it kind of shifted their thought process then, and thought, well, actually, the focus for security should be mobile devices, and they've introduced things like Intune, corporate company portal, so they can securely access applications, and then again a BYOD policy for contractors, again, which is securing the data endpoint, and then also introducing information protection and data loss prevention policies on top of that. So yeah, with that, over to you, Charlie.
Okay. Yeah, I think you were going to do this one quickly, weren't you, Warren?
Yeah, well, I thought we were going to take that one out, weren't we? But I can do it. Don't mind. Yeah. So we talk about we talk about cloud capabilities and bringing enterprise to SMB and mid-market. This for me is it's a great way of showing how these capabilities are coming to the market, and they're ready to consume, ready to set up. So Azure Sentinel is it's called a SIEM, so security incident and event monitoring solution, and effectively it's a way of aggregating logs from all of your devices and endpoints, taking signals from those devices, and then using artificial intelligence and policies to effectively look for ways to secure and audit the use of services and data. I think it's a real good example of how these types of capabilities can be brought to all of your organizations and really bring that security guardrails that we talked about, while also ensuring that you bring absolutely next level ways of introducing productivity into your organization. Thanks, Charlie.
Cheers, Warren. So the next slide, I'm going to actually go through some bits around the reference architecture. Now, this is more kind of scenario based. So I'm going to introduce you to somebody called Bob, and he's a user for a made up corporation, but Bob is the financial director. So the scenario we're going to use is Bob wants to access the company's financial reports, which are an Excel file stored within Microsoft Teams. So from kind of a security standpoint, etc. So Bob's in the office today and he's logging into his Windows 10 laptop at his desk. So to log in, he's using Windows Hello, which is passwordless. So it uses his face. So suddenly the camera does a scan of his face and it logs him in. It allows him to log in that way and go straight into his environment because he's in a trusted location. So Bob on his Windows 10 laptop is fully patched, protected by Microsoft Defender, and so we know it's secure. And so he can go off happily, browse the Teams area and access his financial report spreadsheet, open it up on the desktop application and look at it. And this is all done through this is all seamless to the end user from this perspective, because actually in the background, what happens is when Bob logs in, what you end up with is a whole load of threat targets and everything here that go through and it checks, and the same with the device. So Microsoft claim, and it's been widely publicized, and this has gone up over the last several years. It started off at 3 trillion, it's it went to 6.5 trillion, and now it's over 8 trillion signals that a day that they're putting into their integrated intelligent security graph. And that looks at various factors around what is classed as a threat, what is not classed as a threat. It looks on whether a password may have been leaked. It looks at behavior analytics. A raft of information all gets fed into this conditional access engine. And the same with the device, whether the device is compliant, etc. Now, because Bob's logged in from his trusted location on his trusted corporate compliant device, there's been no unusual activity on his account. It then goes and says, actually, yeah, okay, great, here's your token, and evaluates it. So from there, it then goes off and says, actually, Bob, you can go off and collect, you can go and get that. You've got the rights to go and get that file and access it on your local version of Outlook, of Excel. So that's an example of being in the office. Now, obviously, a lot of us aren't in the office at the moment. Well, no, pretty much none of us. So let's go for an example that's slightly different, and again, this would have happened pre-COVID, but wouldn't happen now. Bob's travelled overnight to his villa in the south of France. Lovely life he's got. He's left his work laptop at home, but as he's arrived, he's received an email from his CEO basically saying, I need you to have a look at the financial reports as there's a discrepancy on there. So all Bob has is his personal phone and his personal MacBook. So Bob signs into his MacBook, he launches a browser and goes to log into the company portal. As he puts in his username and password, because it's a location that is not trusted, it prompts him for MFA. Now, there's several options that could be. That could be a code through the Microsoft Authenticator app. It could be a text message. It could be a phone call. It could even just be a notification that he has to just say allow. But anyway, it prompts him because the conditional access engine knows that he's not coming from a trusted location and he's on an unmanaged device. So it takes that information and goes, okay, well, we've now verified that this is Bob. Great. Okay, it's an untrusted device and he wants to access this file. Well, we're not going to let you download that file, Bob, because it's corporate sensitive data. So what you can do is we're going to control your session. We're going to make sure that you can only view and edit that file within the web browser. So it means that data is no longer being copied outside of the organization. It's being nice and secure in the bubble. And then, so again, very, very kind of seamless approach for the end user, for Bob in this case, because he's got to stick an MFA code. So the key around MFA, it's something you are and something you have, multi-factor. So he had his phone, which was enabled for it, and he had his obviously username and password. Then finally, the third example I'm going to give with this scenario, just to try and talk through some of this, is Bob's received an email from the IT team within the organization asking him to log into his account. However, unbeknown to Bob, it was a fake email, so his account's now been phished. So in the background, somebody's now attempting to log into Bob's account from somewhere else around the globe. Now, Bob's logged from his office in Bristol, and you've got somebody logging in Canada, trying to connect into his account. Straight away, this flags up as a risk to Azure AD. And what that does is basically, because there's been multiple times and they're not able to get past the MFA, because it suddenly starts prompting the user in Canada, or the hacker, the person who's phished the account in Canada, for MFA credentials, and they can't do that, then it basically blocks the access. So that account's now protected. However, when Bob tries to log in again from Bristol, they can tell that he's on his corporate device, he's on a trusted location. However, they know that his account's been compromised. because he's had this illegal login attempt. So what it does is it directs him to the self-service password reset, Azure AD self-service password reset. So he has to verify himself with MFA again, but it remediates his account. So then he has to change his password, therefore still again protecting the environment. So this is it's a sample approach to how we do it, but it is how kind of all these elements fit in. Now, again, that was a little bit more invasive for the end user, but it's protecting that identity, which is, again, as we talked about earlier, it's one of the key points that is most vulnerable attack vector. And really kind of, we're now going to move on to really what the next steps is. So from an ITEC perspective, we've implemented a solution that obviously we're going to be offering five to participants of the webinar today. So, and this is a Microsoft 365 security assessment. And so what we're going to do through this is we're going to look through these assessments, and this can be also purchased as a paid activity. We're going to be looking at kind of your key business requirements, so understanding your business, but also scoring your current configuration of Microsoft 365 against best and recommended practice. And then from that, you'll get a report, which is traffic light grading, so red, amber, green. And that will highlight kind of critical aspects, which are high risk. It's then going to highlight any warnings, so any ambers, which kind of we see as actually they're nice, you should be doing them, but they're the shoulds really rather than the musts. And then kind of anywhere where actually the configuration you've got is great already. And then this will be able to highlight whether there's any areas that need to be tackled to help your business and protect your business and organizations. Obviously, the other side of things is really, so, and we haven't really touched on the licensing side of things. So Microsoft have various packages, but there's a couple of plans, my M365 Business Premium, which includes a lot of these security aspects into that. And I know some of our customers are already on that plan and may not be getting the value from that. And the same with the E5 and E3 and E5 plans as well. And these are tool sets that really give you a better return on investment. Then it's the big takeaway for me, and if everyone on this webinar would do this, is enabling MFA. As we talked about, it prevents over 99.9% of attacks on accounts. Now, making sure that it's not just a case of just clicking it and going, but it's about getting it right for your employees and making sure that it's not going to be death by MFA, but it keeps your organization secure. And that's ITEC can help out with that side of things as well. And then finally is developing that roadmap and building out that roadmap to understand what zero trust is, and that it's not just an end goal, it's a journey that you keep moving forward on. And as Warren said, a lot of the technologies that are now available on offer have these principles embedded into them. So I'm now going to pass you back over to Warren.
No, I'd just like to say, yeah, thank you, thanks for spending the time with us today. Really appreciate it. I'm quite conscious that we're running very close to it. If we've got any questions at the minute, we haven't got anything submitted. I'll give it 30 seconds and see if there's anything coming through. But if not, feel free to reach out to your account manager, and if you'd like to engage with us, on further discussions on this or anything to do with cloud computing or any other solutions that you might want us to look at, then let us know. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks a lot. Okay, nothing come through, so. Okay, thanks very much for everyone to attending this session, and yeah, have a great day. Take care all. Bye.